So, David, welcome to the podcast. I feel like this should have happened years ago.
Well, it's a pleasure. I'm really thrilled and honored to be invited.
You wrote a book, Rethinking the Atonement, which is a more streamlined version of a bigger book. And this is one of the few books where I have underlined and dog-eared so much I had to buy a second copy. So
Well, you can
you're in
buy a
like
third and a fourth copy too.
you're like in Robert Jensen territory now.
Oh
'Cause I
wow.
have
Well,
multiple copies of a lot of his books. But I've been wanting to have you on, and we're just about to enter Holy Week. And so I thought it was even more important for people to hear what you have to say. But first, I want people to, who is David Moffitt?
mm, yeah, that is a great question. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer it,
That's
but
clearly you went to Duke because that's a very Karwasian answer.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. So I don't know, just some of the basics. So I um did my undergraduate at Grove City College and had a sort of moment when I was an undergrad of thinking that I felt a strong sense of call to seminary. I was terrified of Greek and Hebrew, but I thought, okay, so I started taking Greek in my undergraduate as a fleece, really, and enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. Ended up going to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for seminary. Did an MDiv there, and then went to Duke for THM and PhD. I taught at Duke for a year, then got a job at Campbell teaching New Testament. Campbell is a small school outside of Raleigh, south of Raleigh. And then took a post at St. Andrews, which is where we're at now. We moved here in 2013. So married to my college girlfriend. We've been happily married for many years now. We got married in 1996, and we have two boys, both of whom are now in university here in the UK. One is down in London at UCL doing neuroscience, and the other is in Edinburgh doing computer science. So no theologians yet.
That's cool.
Yeah,
That's
I
cool.
like that.
Edinburgh is a beautiful city.
Yeah, it's a great city. Yeah, Scotland is truly a stunningly beautiful country, especially when the weather's nice.
Yeah, I keep pitching my wife on the like, can we get a vacation place in Scotland?
Yeah.
I haven't been persuasive yet.
Yeah, well, mid-December when it's raining sideways and the sun is up at like 9 and goes down at 3, not so nice. But in the middle of the summer, long days, beautiful weather, when you get it, it's gorgeous.
So, rethinking the atonement, I think, David, that Leviticus is probably the most neglected book of the Bible for
Yeah,
Christians, and then as a consequence, we don't really know how to read the letter to the Hebrews.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
And then we end up creating distinctions between crucifixion, Easter, and Ascension that are not helpful.
Mm.
Can you just begin by talking about the macro argument of these collections of essays here in this book?
Yeah, so it all started for me when I began to work on my doctoral dissertation at Duke on the Epistle to the Hebrews. And I had actually first kind of cut my teeth on Hebrews at Trinity. I took an advanced Greek exegesis course with D.A. Carson, and we worked through the text in Greek. I learned a lot. It was great. I remember Carson making this comment that, the resurrection didn't really matter for the Epistle to the Hebrews. Of course, you write it in your notes and think, oh, yes. And then you read commentaries and you find multiple commentators are saying basically this as well. And that stuck with me. And I began to think, actually, I think I can see ways in which the resurrection does seem to matter for the argument of Hebrews. So I started writing a doctoral dissertation focused on resurrection in Hebrews. And I had no intention of getting into sacrifice or atonement. It just, I knew how that worked. I'd grown up in a pretty solidly Reformed Baptist context, and I understood atonement and, common evangelical stuff. And I came face to face with a problem about maybe a year into the dissertation, or at least thinking hard about the dissertation. That was Hebrews says that Jesus presents himself to the Father in the heavenly tabernacle. It's especially in chapter 9, say 24 through 26. But I knew that that was just a metaphor for talking about the significance, maybe not just a metaphor, but it was metaphor that was primarily talking about the significance of the crucifixion. That's really where Jesus presents himself to the Father as a sacrifice. When I put a discrete resurrection.
Ironically, that's where he presents himself to his mother.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right. Right. But when I started making an argument that put a discrete bodily resurrection into the argument of Hebrews, suddenly I could not make Jesus in heaven presenting himself to the Father in the heavenly tabernacle be the same thing as him dying on the cross. The resurrection kind of drove a wedge between my understanding of sacrifice and atonement as Jesus presenting himself to God as he dies on the cross as a sacrifice. The resurrection put a wedge between that and what Hebrews actually seemed to be demanding, which was that Jesus was present in this heavenly tabernacle. And that sent me into a kind of tailspin, frankly. It's fair to say a bit of depression for several months because I just thought, I'm wrong. And I suddenly saw with clarity why so many people in the modern period because I wasn't the first one, of course, to ask the question about resurrection in Hebrews, but I suddenly understood why so many people had backed away from resurrection in Hebrews, because it fundamentally challenged what I thought had to be the way in which the cross was functioning as Jesus' sacrifice.
Yeah, so make this explicit.
Yeah.
Because what you're really saying is the way that a lot of preachers and most Christians talk about sacrifice is wrong.
Yeah, that's ultimately where I got to. I mean, I didn't see that at the time.
Why I avoid talking about it at all costs.
Yeah, but let me just narrate it a bit, if you'll allow me to do a bit of autobiography here. So I remember I was just stuck on this problem and thinking, okay, like I'm wrong. I've done all this work. It's wrong. I'm not going to go into the exegetical weeds right now. I mean, we can if you want, but
Yeah,
I just couldn't. I couldn't make Hebrews work, right? And I remember thinking about this one day, and just suddenly this little thing clicked in my mind, like, because I grew up in a Christian context. As I said, it was Reformed. And I mean, one of the great things about the Reformed tradition is how much it really does care about Scripture.
mm-hmm.
And I had grown up in a context where there was, what was referred to as expository preaching. It maybe wasn't that ultimately, but it certainly was. It certainly was preaching that consistently, repeatedly worked you through texts. So I had read Leviticus before. I knew something about Leviticus. And as I was sitting there thinking about this problem, there was just a little inkling in my mind that suddenly was like, wait a minute, there's a lot more to sacrifice in Leviticus than just killing the animal. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thought. So I got home from that day in my office and Duke, and I thought, you know what, I should just go read Leviticus again. So I sat down and I read Leviticus straight through, one sitting. And all I did was ask one question. And that was, what does the death of the animal do? And that's when the penny dropped. Because suddenly, as I read Leviticus with that thought in mind, I saw that the text seemed to suggest that the death of the animal was not the central aspect of sacrifice. It shows up, well, really, it's really just the first 7 chapters. I wish I could have saved myself a bit of time, but it's really the first 7 chapters, right, where you get these descriptions of the 5 basic kinds of sacrifice. And when it involves an animal, the death of the animal is basically half a verse. It's he shall slaughter. You don't know who does it even in Leviticus proper. It's just not the focal point of what's going on in the ritual, because it's after the slaughter that you suddenly get, 3, 4, 5, 6 verses about all the things that happen next. And all the things that happen next are involving priests approaching the altar. And then, of course, in Leviticus 16, so it is a good thing I read more. In Leviticus 16, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest actually goes into the Holy of Holies. And I could not have said it this way at that point in time, but I was beginning to notice that sacrifice involved an entire process. It was a whole series of things. that death was part of that when the sacrifice was an animal, but it certainly wasn't the central part, and it wasn't the culmination of it. The culmination actually occurred at altars and on the Day of Atonement when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. And as I said, that was when the penny dropped, because suddenly it looked to me like Hebrews was working with exactly those kinds of directional ideas, and could allow for the idea that there was more going on for what Jesus does as high priest offering a sacrifice than just his death. And that just led to really more years of thinking, of reconceptualizing what's going on with sacrifice, what's going on with Hebrews. And it really gave me a sense that, okay, the evidence I thought I had seen for resurrection in Hebrews was worth pushing on, and that what had to change was not my view of resurrection in Hebrews, but my entire account of sacrifice. I think today I would sum it up in a way that challenges all kinds of things. Like, for example, the idea that Hebrews is one of the most supersessionist texts in the New Testament. I really, at some point, want to take that on as well. I would say that Hebrews, when I read Hebrews with the resurrection in place, made me a better reader of Leviticus. And that blew my mind. Like, that put me on this trajectory that eventually led to this book of essays, and I'm working on a book right now, God willing, that's going to try and push this out further into other parts of the New Testament as well. But it was really bringing resurrection into Hebrews and allowing the text to pressure me and follow its logic, in the case of Hebrews, straight into the Holy of Holies in heaven. And then going back and saying, like, wait a minute, Hebrews appears to be ticking with a logic that however Leviticus comes together, people who perform Levitical sacrifice would have, I think, understood.
So, what you're saying, if people are following along, is that despite what Jesus says on the cross, it is not finished.
Yeah, well, so this comes up all the time, as well it should. Okay, I mean, this is there in John 19:30. We ought to look at it. I did write an essay, and it's in Rethinking the Atonement, entitled "This It Is Not Finished," as a polemical move, no question. But what I like to ask students when I'm teaching this sort of thing, because those who know the Bible, this is one of the first places they're going to go, is, okay, tell me what the it is. Because one of the things that I'm trying to do when I'm teaching is get us all to think hard about our assumptions. We have to have assumptions whenever we communicate with other people, or there's no communication. I'm drawing this from semiotics, especially people like Umberto Eco, and a kind of notion of an encyclopedia that's bounded by culture. We have to have assumptions. But as much as assumptions can help us, so that I don't have to define every single word I'm using right now, I can assume that you're able to interpret at speed more or less what I'm trying to communicate, because we all share a common language. As much as those assumptions can help us, well, they can also, of course, blind us. They can keep us from seeing certain things. And when we say, when Jesus says it is finished, I think it's quite common for modern readers in particular to hang an entire atonement theology, if you'll forgive the pun, to hang an entire atonement theology on the cross right there. And the it simply stands in for whatever that atonement theology is. And I'm not an expert on the Gospel of John, but I would at least want to query whether or not something like, say, a later notion of penal substitutionary atonement as kind of the whole deal really can be shoehorned into that it. We just tend to assume it, and then it becomes a proof text for saying, the death of Jesus did all the work that has to be done.
Because
is there work to be done on the it then? Like, what is the
I do think there is. Yeah, I really do think there is. I'm not ready to put anything in print. But
that's the next book after the book you're working on.
I don't know if I'll get into John's Gospel or not. I'm telling you, I do have a chapter on Johannine epistles, but I would push for a notion of the it being primarily the defeat of the devil. That what Jesus is really talking about there is something about the captivity of creation to the devil, and the rule of the devil being crushed and defeated. That's where I would want to at least begin to go. And interestingly, I've found that I'm not alone on this. It seems to be what Origen actually thinks as well as a number of other patristic figures. The death of Jesus is very closely linked to the defeat of the devil, of course, the harrowing of hell, and all this sort of stuff in early Christian thinking.
So one of the things that you make clear in the book that I found really helpful is if we really understand the Levitical system, the sacrifice that Christ makes happens after God raises him from the dead and he presents his risen life to the Father. And this has, this is, I mentioned Robert Jensen earlier, but, he makes a comment in his chapter on crucifixion. He makes the comment that we should notice that what we call atonement theories developed after there was no longer any familiarity with practicing sacrifice.
Yeah.
That Hebrews' understanding of sacrifice, it has implications for how we understand penal substitution.
Mm-hmm.
You make the comment in the book that the animal, because the animal is a gift, it's not to be abused.
That's right. It has to be unblemished, right? Yeah. Which tells you that when they viewed slaughtering an animal, their assumptions are very different than ours.
Yeah.
They're not assuming that what we're doing here is abusing or punishing or hurting the animal. It's just a different set. We might have our moral qualms about that, but I think we just need to be willing, whatever our views are, to recognize that their views might be very different. And in a case like this, they seem to be very different. Sacrifice is a very orderly process, and the animal is not made to suffer. It's slaughtered in a very particular way. I've never seen this happen. I know people who have gone to Samaria, for example, and watched Samaritans actually still perform sacrifice. So I never have, but as I understand it, you slit the throat in a very particular way so that the blood gushes out. The blood was collected in a bowl, and then various things happen in a very orderly way. And actually, you can go to a passage like Ezekiel 44, where the prophet, talking about this future coming temple, very clearly distinguishes between the significance, or should I say the importance, weightiness of the act of slaughter, which is something that the Levites are allowed to do, and the weightiness and importance of approaching the altar with the blood and the fat, which only the priests are allowed to do. And that's described as serving God when you bring the blood and the fat into his presence. So, right there is a pretty clear distinction between the significance of slaughter, which is part of the ritual, and the sort of center of gravity, which is bringing the blood and the flesh into the presence of God by putting it on an altar and in this case, burning it. To come back to the point about Jesus' sacrifice, I think for many of us today, sacrifice is a set of abstract ideas. But in the ancient world, sacrifice was a very concrete activity in which you gave a gift to a god. And giving that gift to the god, the gift that you give was the sacrifice. There may be all kinds of ways where you could speculate on elements of that. I'm not saying there was no abstract thought that could be brought to that, but the actual ritual involved giving a gift to God. The gift is the sacrifice, not the act of slaughter, for example. And what I'm ultimately arguing, I argue this in chapter 10 of Rethinking the Atonement, which is on directional ideas and the incarnation, that Jesus is the sacrifice that he offers to the Father. It is actually his blood and his flesh, which he presents to the Father. That is why I can talk about his offering himself as a sacrifice in the heavenly tabernacle. That's not to say that it's completely cut off from the death. It isn't. It's to say it's not reducible to the death, and that the slaughter is not sacrifice. The sacrifice is the giving of himself, which he does when he passes through the heavens. Hebrews 4:14, enters the heavenly tabernacle, 10:19 and following, and then again in 9:24 through 26, actually appears before the face of God for us, which is priestly language. I mean, Ezekiel talks about the priests again appearing before the face of God. That's part of how you perform your ministry. So he presents himself to the Father, which again is where the resurrection is absolutely a sine qua non for the logic of this argument. He is able to present his blood and his flesh to God because he ascends with them into heaven and offers them as perfected humanity to the Father as a sacrifice.
Boom.
Wow.
Tier, how has this messed up your
I'm just thinking, like, I can't wait to preach Ascension Sunday now. Like, this is going to be
right?
so much more fun than just Jesus ascending. And, typically what I've done, and this is, I mean, confession time, is make the ascension more about us. Like, as Jesus ascends, he's taking all of humanity with him, right? And presenting all of us now before God. But that reduces it makes us part of, if not the main character in the story, which reduces everything once again.
And it's not wrong, right? It's just that I think you're right that it can shift the focus away from the Son of God returning to the presence of God and saying, "Here I am, and the children that you have given me."
Well, and what you're saying, like the way I'm preaching it in my mind right now, as I'm like panicking, is that what I'm talking about is good for a Bible study and talking about all the nuances of this and the meanings. Whereas in the act of proclamation, it's about the fulfillment. It's about the totality of what Christ has done, which takes the focus off of us entirely,
And what you've recovered, David, it does away with, I think, unhelpful presentations of the Passion story where Jesus is the passive victim, in our place. It insists on an understanding of Good Friday, Easter, and Ascension as a triune work, in which that Jesus has agency in this. And you make the point in the book too that the logic of these 3 days is that if Jesus is not now continuously interceding for us, salvation is impossible.
Yeah, Hebrews just seems to say that, and that takes us back to the "it is not finished" point, and which, as I said, I was trying to get people's attention with that.
You got mine.
There's no question about it, right?
I stole it as the title of my sermon from Sunday.
Oh, right. Well, but there is a really serious point here, and that is that if we imagine that Hebrews, I mean, I think this is probably written by a Jewish believer in Jesus and probably written to a Jewish community, all kinds of debates about things like that, of course. If this is at least someone who understands how Levitical sacrifice, Jewish sacrifice, would have actually more or less played out. And well, there are lots of roads we could go down. But if we take that point, and then it would certainly, such a person would know that you don't offer sacrifice to God by going away from the presence of God. And this is an interesting point because the New Testament pretty consistently links the death of Jesus. Paul explicitly says that this is Jesus this is the Son moving away from the Father.
Yeah.
That's not how you offer a sacrifice to God. You offer a sacrifice to God by moving into the presence of God and bringing the gift and presenting it to him. So if you take that sort of model, then when a verse like Hebrews 7:25 says that he is able to save completely and to the full extent those who come to God through him because he always lives to intercede for them, then I think what we're getting there is a model of Jesus' ongoing intercession, which is directly tied. I mean, this is what Hebrews 7 is all about in any case, directly tied to his high priestly identity and therefore also his high priestly ministry, which occurs in the presence of God when, at least in, say, Leviticus 16, the high priest goes into the presence of God to offer the blood. Hebrews 9:7 explicitly reflects on the high priest in the Holy of Holies in terms of, it uses sacrificial language, the high priest offering the blood. And Hebrews is bringing that idea to bear on Jesus as the high priest who is now in the heavenly presence of the Father, in the heavenly tabernacle, and he is actively working on behalf of his people. This is what the "it is not finished" is trying to point to. And I like when I teach this with students, I like to ask the question the following way: what would happen if Jesus stopped interceding for his people? And the logic of Hebrews 7:25, he is able to save them completely because he always lives to intercede for them, suggests that what would happen is you wouldn't get complete salvation. And then it's worth asking, well, what good is an incomplete salvation?
Yeah.
And if that logic holds up, then we absolutely have to have Jesus right now interceding in order to actually receive full and final salvation, whatever that's going to look like in the future. Hebrews is not alone on this point. 1 John 1:7 through 2:2,
Man,
I think,
you
has
clearly went to Grove City College. You just, these verses just come right.
I'm just thinking he's not United Methodist for sure.
Well, these verses anyway, you clearly have in 1 John 1:7 through 2:2 Jewish sacrificial ideas, right? Because you said, if you confess your sin, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sin and purify us from all unrighteousness. This is linked with the fact that it's the blood of Jesus that brings purification. That's basically 1:7 through 10. Now, I've actually had really astute parishioners ask, why do we still need to confess our sin? And they're basically picking up on John 19:30 and loading that with all kinds of atonement weight and saying, if everything is finished on the cross, why do I still need to confess my sin?
Or even, like, part of my problem with so much presentations of the atonement is it requires like a cognitive dissonance about the world that we live in.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, if Christ is not still working to perfect creation,
why is it not perfect? Yeah. That's a great point. But to come back to this, why do we still need to confess? I mean, I think sometimes, Tier, maybe to what you were talking about, what we end up with is really just anthropology, right? Like, it's good for the soul. It's good for you. All of Jesus' work doing this is done and over, and there's nothing left. But you still need to do it because it's good for you. That is not what 1 John is saying. And I can say that, I think, with a degree of confidence because of where he goes next. In 2:1 and 2, he says, my little children, I'm writing these things to you. Apparently what he just said, so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, well, it's game over because that was all taken care of and you missed out. No. We an advocate with the Father. And he is our atoning sacrifice. See, Jesus is identified as the sacrifice. He is the sacrifice, not his death. He is the sacrifice. And his location is identified as being right now with the Father. And he's not just sitting there twiddling his thumbs. He is actively advocating. And why is that important? Because we still sin.
this is so.
That's why we have to confess our sin, because we know there's a way to deal with it. And the way to deal with it is very much along the lines of how you would deal with this in the Old Covenant. A sacrifice would be presented, a priest would intercede for you, and the sin could be dealt with. Now, that sacrifice is Jesus. And although John doesn't use this language, the idea of him advocating before the Father sure looks high priestly. And he's there with the Father right now. So it's not anthropology, at least not in a sort of makes you feel better. It's precisely that there is a mechanism for maintaining the relationship between God and his people that orbits around the risen and ascended Jesus being in the presence of the Father. And this, I think, is what Paul's getting at in Romans 8:12.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I think one of the positive byproducts of this is that you're showing a respect for the righteousness of God that, that say like penal substitution wants to get at. But I think it does so in a problematic way that it isn't that because of Jesus, God doesn't take sin seriously anymore.
No, certainly not.
Or that the Father is not holy. And
yeah.
I mean, so you're taking all of that seriously, but in a way that's consistent with the story of Jesus.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I always enjoy sort of reading, talking about assumptions again, sort of reading what people are assuming that I affirm or deny when I haven't actually affirmed or denied the things that they assume. And I just want to say, like, that we can have all kinds of debates about what penal substitution even means, but I don't know of any place where I've ever denied penal substitution. I do happen to think that something that looks very similar to certain accounts of penal substitution shows up in Isaiah 53. Now that's obviously, again, another contested text. But what I don't think Isaiah 53 is doing is presenting the servant as a sacrifice. And I'm not alone on that. And for what it's worth, I do think early Christians are looking at Isaiah 53 and thinking in terms of the way in which God has said he will allow for the covenant relationship which has been broken to be restored. And when the covenant relationship is broken, the one thing you cannot do is offer sacrifice. So there are multiple reasons why I think sacrifice is the wrong lens to read Isaiah 53 in. But ultimately, what I am arguing, this is why people think I do deny penal substitution. What I am arguing is that penal substitution, that sort of idea, is just not a logic that's present in Levitical sacrifice. It's not a logic that's present there. And insofar as early Christians are picking up on sacrificial ideas from their scriptures, I do not think that they are loading those sacrificial ideas with a penal substitution idea. I think they could recognize that there would be distinctions there. Now, within the person of Jesus, all of these things, because he's the one who died and rose and ascended and now intercedes and will return, all of these things could be applied to him. But what I'm arguing is that early Christians would not have mashed them all up and reduced them only to a single event, namely the crucifixion. They were capable of thinking across the story of Jesus and thinking about different ways in which different aspects of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, ascension, intercession contribute to salvation. That's what I'm really arguing.
Yeah, I've mentioned this before, but I just got back from a pilgrimage in Turkey, and I knew it rationally, but it surprised me to see with my eyes how few images of the crucifixion there were in all of these churches.
Yeah.
And so it's assumptions can be blinding.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, the cross is important for the earliest Christians, no question about it. But you're right. It's not really until the 6th century that we start to get depictions of the crucifixion. And, it's worth at least thinking about that, because that tends to be, it's like those pictures have tended to captivate us. And we tend to think only in terms of the crucifixion. Maybe the resurrection is the proof. I mean, the best, like, I don't know how many Easter services I've sat through, which were really just Good Friday.
I preached a few of those.
I mean, with a smile, fair enough, but it's still just Good Friday all over again. But what I've tended to hear is this is the proof that God accepted the sacrifice. Like, okay, now let's go back to our idea. What you're basically saying is Jesus goes away from the Father, offers himself as a sacrifice to the Father away from the Father. The Father accepts it away from his presence. Then after all of that, Jesus returns to the presence of the Father, enters a space that Hebrews calls the tabernacle in heaven, and presents himself to the Father, and none of that is sacrificial. I mean, it really borders on incoherent. Yeah. So there are just issues there that I think we should think hard about that might, I think, suggest that Good Friday not be the dead center, again, if you'll forgive the pun, but actually is itself a sine qua non for salvation and is potentially doing very particular salvific work without having to be the whole way in which Jesus saves us. I mean, I think when we think about atonement, I like to tell my students, look, there are multiple problems that keep God and humanity apart. And this is why I think we get multiple metaphors that get used across Scripture. Jesus solves all the problems, but he doesn't solve all the problems in the same way and at the same time. And that, I think, allows us to then recover Leviticus and see that the logic that's there in Leviticus actually is informing how we think about Jesus, informing how early Christians are thinking about Jesus, and not just the other way around, not just a sort of preformed atonement theology that then you take back and you use to kind of like, well, basically ignore most of Leviticus and only focus on, one particular part of the sacrificial ritual.
So
Wow.
change gears a little bit. You mentioned earlier in the conversation about the devil, and one of your chapters, your essays in this book, and spoiler alert for people who have to hear me on Holy Thursday, you brought to my attention. I didn't know, or I had never noticed how Hebrews narrates the Passover in a way that does not make God the active agent of the plague killing the firstborn. So talk a little bit about that.
Right. So, I mean, you're not alone not to really notice the Passover in Hebrews. Most modern commentators think that it's really not important for Hebrews. It's only explicitly mentioned in 11:28, where the writer talks about Moses by the aspersion of blood. Can't remember exactly what it says there, but ultimately rescuing the firstborn. What I argue is that in 2:14 and following, where you get this idea of Jesus' death directly linked with the defeat of the devil, the imagery that the author uses there is that you've been held captive, you've been enslaved by the fear of death, and this figure, the devil, kept you enslaved, and you've been set free from that, liberated from that by the death of Jesus. And where the author then goes in terms of the way in which the argument of Hebrews actually unfolds. This is right toward the end of chapter 2 when he makes this point about deliverance from the devil who held you in slavery by defeating the devil. He then goes straight into 3 and 4, which look at Moses and then the people in the wilderness. I think that that's not likely to be a mere coincidence. I mean, many people think that Hebrews is sort of laid out as everything Jewish bad, Jesus is better. So, you got angels, well, Jews like angels, so Jesus is better. You've got Moses, well, Jesus is better. You've got Israel in the wilderness, well, Jesus does something better for his people. Aaron, etc. And that they think is the logic. This is very common in the commentary literature. I think this writer is not. He clearly is saying that Jesus is better. But for what it's worth, and several commentators do pick up on this, in the ancient world, when you compared two things, often what you were trying to do is take two things that people would normally think of as being basically equal and showing that as good as one thing is, this other thing is somehow better. And the skill that you had was demonstrating that. That I think is the logic that Hebrews is using for this comparison. You know how great Moses is? Jesus is better. But even still, I think there's a logic that underlies the way the author actually plays his argument out. And that logic, I think, is coming straight out of the Pentateuch. It is the story of Israel's liberation from Egypt and the enslavement that they had in Egypt under Pharaoh. And where do they go? They go into the wilderness. This is why Hebrews moves from defeating the enslaving power now as the devil and saying that you're like Israel in the wilderness. And the whole goal of moving through the wilderness is then to enter into the promised land. And Hebrews goes right into the promised rest in Hebrews chapter 4. And inheritance is a major motif that runs straight through Hebrews. So I think Hebrews is really thinking about the big story of Israel being liberated from slavery, going into the wilderness, and then headed towards the promises and ultimately the promised inheritance that God has for them. And when you read the defeat of the devil and then the move into the wilderness, together with these ideas of inheritance that run straight through Hebrews, I think what you see is that Hebrews is taking that narrative and transposing it into a kind of apocalyptic key, where the real enemy who is intent on mucking up God's good creation and who is beating people down and holding them in slavery is the devil. And that's where the real battle has to be met. And what Jesus does in his death is something that's a lot like Passover, a lot like what Moses did. And, it's no accident that Jesus dies at Passover, that early Christians would make that sort of, early followers of Jesus would make that sort of connection. But we can also see in certain texts that are circulating before the time of Jesus. So scholars will often talk about the Second Temple period. There's a text called Jubilees, in which the whole Passover narrative itself is presented as, yes, a kind of battle between Moses and Pharaoh, but really behind the scenes is this Satan figure called Mastema, a malevolent angelic being pulling the strings, and he's keeping the people enslaved, and Moses is actually doing battle with him. So there's really good precedent for Jews who have more apocalyptic ideas to think in these categories. And that's what I think Hebrews is just picking up on and developing. So Jesus and Moses, Jesus is better, but Jesus is actually doing something that Moses already prefigures. In the Passover, in the applying of blood, there is a defeat of not just Pharaoh, but this malevolent being behind him. And Hebrews names that the devil and says, now you've really been liberated from the power of that enslaver. And you're in the wilderness, which is, by the way, why the tabernacle is so important for Hebrews. You're in the wilderness, but now you have someone who, like Moses, has gone up the mountain, who, like Joshua, has gone into the promised land, who, like the high priest, has gone into the Holy of Holies. And he's gonna, like Moses, like Joshua, like the high priest, he's gonna come back to you. And when that happens, you get the promised inheritance. So don't give up on it.
It's really good.
I don't even know what to say, Jason. I don't know what to ask now. I don't even know. I'm gonna have to. One of the perks of this podcast is I get to edit this, which means I get to listen to it again.
Okay, yeah.
Which means I get to listen to it again.
I'm sorry.
It's, I mean, yeah, it's just, I mean, and you do, like, this is another essay that you have that I think it's not just the assumptions that get in the way. It's, I think too much of the commentary that preachers, for example, rely on no longer have a serious engagement with someone like Origen or the other church fathers. Yeah. And I think that's unfortunate.
You know, I genuinely, I don't know if anyone said this, but I came away from certain aspects of my seminary training with the view that Origen was just this kind of, clownish, risible figure. Like, he's just making nonsense up. And I could not believe when I started actually reading Origen. And what got me into it was the fact that certain people, and again, totally fairly based on where the conversation is in contemporary biblical studies, certain people read my work and said, well, no one's ever read Hebrews the way you're trying to read Hebrews, so you must be wrong. And I had worried about that all the way through writing the dissertation. Like, where is this? And I always thought in the back of my mind, at some point, I need to try and track this down. I had seen a couple little clues that maybe there was something there, that maybe, just maybe, the ascension was more important and things like that. But it was really when I got that direct pushback from I. Howard Marshall, as it happens, that it just forced me to do the work. And I sat down with the Biblia Patristica and went through the index there and just looked for Hebrews and went and started reading passages. And I could not believe what I saw in Origen in his homilies on Leviticus, of all places. He's reading Hebrews and Leviticus together. And he's working with a lot more than what I've laid out. But basically, it includes this idea that Jesus, well, yeah, this is just kind of cool. I don't know how much time we have, but there's a tradition that we know from Philo, at least. I'm sure it's older, but I at least know it's there as early as Philo, who's looking at Leviticus 16 and asking the question, why does the high priest change from his high priestly garment into a linen garment before he goes into the Holy of Holies? And basically Philo's answer is, well, the high priestly garment is spun from wool, which comes from a mortal, an animal that dies. And you would never take that into the presence of God. Linen, on the other hand, is spun from flax, which comes from a plant. So there's no death involved. And so you put on the linen garment, because you're going into God's presence. Now that's hugely illuminating for so many reasons.
Yeah.
Not least because Philo doesn't say this, but you do take blood into the presence of God. And it must be pretty obvious, self-evident, that blood is not death, it's life, which is what Leviticus 17:11 actually says. Anyway, Origen knows this tradition as well. And so he thinks about Jesus in the passion and resurrection and ascension, and he plugs in Leviticus 16, and he says that when Jesus dies, he's like the man who takes the scapegoat into the wilderness and then abandons it in the wilderness.
Right, like this is the whole other thing that like so many misuses of Yom Kippur
totally
to explain the atonement, and I'm like, well, if he's the scapegoat, like he gets to live. They don't like
well, what someone like Origen is picking up on. I mean, you're right that the scapegoat isn't killed. Contrary, I mean, in Second Temple tradition, maybe the scapegoat was killed, but the bigger thing is this is the one animal that we know in the whole sacrificial system actually has sin placed upon it. And that animal goes away from the presence of God. That animal is not given to God. It doesn't move into God's presence. Why? Almost certainly because it's bearing sin. So it goes away from God's presence because God wants the sin out of his house. Origen picks up on this and says that Jesus takes the powers of sin and death and he drags them down into hell. Because who could think of a more wilderness place than hell? And he abandons them there. Then, and here's John 19:30, his work finished. Yeah? Then he says he puts on his high priestly linen garment. And that, he says, and now he's picking up on this Alexandrian tradition. Well, it's probably bigger than that, but at least, we know it from Philo at least. He says he puts on his linen garment. And linen, we all know, is spun from flax, which comes from a seed, which falls into the ground and dies and then springs up. And he's talking 1 Corinthians 15. So the whole idea is that after Jesus has, like the scapegoat, gone away from God and into hell and defeated the powers, then he comes back and puts on his body, which he cast like a seed into the ground, and now has raised up his high priestly linen garment. And he then ascends into the heavenly presence of God and approaches the heavenly altar, where Origen says he now is making atonement for his people. And he will stay there until the sun sets, which he's looking at the high priest going into the Holy of Holies. And then he will return to us. So Origen says, in the Old Covenant, you had the Day of Atonement, but we now today have the Age of Atonement. And this age will last until Jesus returns. I think it's an astounding reading. And I think it's tapping into logics that, as you said, Jason, we've lost. And he's picking up on things that look sort of like they tick with a profoundly Jewish logic, a profoundly sacrificial logic that we might read today and think is nonsense because we can't get our minds into that very different way of thinking about sacrifice.
Yeah, it's, not to cast aspersions on biblical PhDs, but Origen just clearly knows scripture better than almost anybody.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and clearly has it in his head the way you might a novel you've read several times. Yeah. So it's this is great. This is great.
Yeah,
we should do this again. I could just.
I would love to. God willing, I've got this other book coming out. I've still got to finish it. It's not quite done, in spite of the fact that it's already been advertised. But it's basically, the title of the book is Ascension and Sacrifice, the Return of the Risen Son. And I really just try to get into the weeds with what do we see from Second Temple Jewish literature about the ways that people of the time could imagine sacrifice. And then take that to various New Testament texts. Hebrews will be a part of it. But I'm going to be looking at Paul, especially Romans, looking at 1 John and Acts, and I'm not sure yet about 1 Peter. But noticing that these directional ideas really do matter, and that moving into the presence of God really suggests, I think, that and again, you see this in patristic thought, again, not universally, but it's certainly there. And it's not even a little thing. It's a significant element of patristic thought, that when they think about Jesus presenting himself to the Father as a sacrifice, they think of his ascension. There's one father, gosh, I think it's Procopius, so it's a bit later, an Eastern father, who says, he reads Hebrews 1 with the invitation in 113. God invites the Son to come and sit at his right hand. He reads that and he says, the sacrifice showed up in heaven. And the Father looked at the sacrifice and marveled at it. And he was so pleased with the sacrifice that he invited it to come and sit at his right hand. Like that's a way of reading Hebrews for this church father. The language he uses is gift, by the way, but this is the language of sacrifice in Septuagint. And it just shows that this idea was there. And for me, one of the big questions is beyond my ken, is how it's been so thoroughly lost, at least in a lot of contemporary Christian reflection.
Yeah, it's Jensen again. He makes the point that, both Christianity and rabbinic Judaism superseded the Judaism of Jesus's day.
Yeah.
That the Judaism of the scriptures was lost with the destruction of the temple. And that, yeah. So it's, getting back to old things can be illuminating.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what we do with it theologically is all kinds of open questions and fun and interesting things to reflect on, but trying to actually at least imagine ourselves back into that and question the assumptions we bring, could just be illuminating. Like, you read Leviticus and you discover no animals are slaughtered on the altar. And yet every time I had read Leviticus, I just imagined animals on the altar being slaughtered because I knew that's what sacrifice was. But, things like that, just ways in which the text always has the prerogative and the ability to push back against us, which is why we need to keep going back to it.
Aslan on the stone table.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we're going to bother you again very soon, David.
I'd love that. It's been great. Great chatting with you.
Let me press stop here. And don't log out until you're up.